Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stu Clark with the latest firmware update from Nikon. Most of the talk is about shutter angle. So in this video, we'll take a look at what shutter angle is and then how I've implemented on my Nikon Z8 to get perfect shutter speeds no matter what frame rate I'm shooting. Shutter angle is actually a term going back to film days. If you take a look at this diagram here, basically what happened when you're looking at an old film camera, the film is advancing at either 24, 30, 60, or 120 frames per second. So the film is kind of zipping past the shutter opening here. And then back in the day, they used a rotary shutter. So the rotary shutter is spinning in front of the advancing film. Where shutter angle refers to is the shape of the opening of that circle. When we take a look at this next picture here, so this is basically a really great clear breakdown of how shutter angle will impact your shutter speed. And then we're going to talk about what it means and how you can take advantage of different shutter angles. The shutter angle is effectively the part of the shutter that is open. So you can see the blue part is effectively the part that is open that will allow light through to expose the film correctly. 45 degrees, there's just a 45 degree piece of pie open. 90 degrees, there's a 90 degree chunk open on that circular shutter. 180 degrees, which is what you're going to hear us talk about a lot today, is basically only half of the shutter is there. So if a 360 degree circle, only half. And then 360 degrees is effectively no shutter. So the film is just being fully exposed as it's advanced at 24 frames per second. Let's take a look at this diagram a little bit further. If you imagine as that frame is advancing, if it's 24 frames per second, 1/24th of a second is the amount of time that frame can be exposed, the amount of time it's in front of that opening. So the film can be exposed for a maximum of 1/24th of a second. So if you look at this at say 360 degree here, you can see how the frame interval and the exposure time are equal because there's nothing blocking the exposure time. Basically there's no shutter spinning. So that piece of film, it can be exposed for the full 1/24th of a second that it's moving across that opening in front of the lens. So 30 frames per second is going to be 1/30th of a second, 60 frames per second is going to be 1/60th of a second, and 120 frames per second is going to be 1/20th of a second. So as you increase the frame rate, the film is moving faster, can only be exposed, exposed for a shorter amount of time as it's spinning. So 180 degree shutter, basically you've only got half of the shutter spinning. So it allows for the exposure half of the time. So what that means is that with 24 frames per second, the film can only be exposed for 1/48th of a second. With 30 frames per second, 1/60th of a second. So as this shutter is spinning, it's blocking the light for half of the time. And that's referred to as a 180 degree shutter angle. So you can see with 60 frames per second is 1/120th, 120 frames per second, 1/240th. 90 degree shutter, so this is the film can only be exposed for a quarter of the term because only a quarter of the shutter is open to allow light through. So now we're looking at 196 because we're shorting the duration of the exposure to light as that film is passing the shutter. And then we get down to, so you can see the different frame rates. As you go up in frame rate, you're dealing with, again, shorter duration of exposure because you're dealing with only a quarter of the shutter being open. Same with the 45 degree, you're now down to 1/8. So as that shutter is spinning, only 1/8 of that spin is allowing light to hit the film. This is kind of the essence of what shutter angle is referring to. The larger, so 360 degree means you've got a longer exposure time, so a longer shutter speed. The 45 degree, you can go even to 15 degree, you can go quite a bit narrow, so it's basically called skinny shutter angle when you're getting down to 15 degrees, and it's called shutter drag when you're at the 360 degree side of things. So all of this applies to film, but the principles of what it does to the filming and the production will still hold true on the video side of things. None of this is relevant to today's cameras in terms of how it's happening. The terminology is still being used, and I think it's important to understand that so we can kind of, as we discuss what these different shutter angles will do to your film quality. When you're dealing with shutter angle, 24 frames per second video will be impacted by shutter angle more than 120 frames per second video. And the reason being is that 24 frames per second video is right at the edge of where we start to see frames. Remember when back in the day when you're a kid and you make little drawings where you change slight changes in the drawing from page to page to page, and then you'd flip through them and you'd see that kind of movement as it's moving back and forth. When you get down to 10 frames per second, 15 frames per second, you start to see some of that movement. So 24 frames per second is kind of the minimum that we stop seeing that movement. And the reason it was picked, from what I understand, was it was about saving film, basically shooting at the minimum that you could see it in order to need the least amount of film stock, because film was very expensive. 24 frames has kind of just become the frame rate that's utilized by Hollywood, and it's kind of just stuck as we've gone into the digital age, where it's like I say, it's not as relevant because film, we're not dealing with the high cost film anymore. But with 24 frames per second, whether you have blur between each frame or razor sharp frames, it's more visible than, say, you're shooting at 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second. You're not going to notice blur because there's so many frames per second that you're viewing back. It's much less obvious between frames. So a lot of the shutter angle talk is if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, it's going to be more obvious than if you're shooting at 120 frames per second. So let's talk about that, and we'll talk about when you're kind of dragging the shutter, making the skinny shutter, and the impact on your video. Okay, we'll talk at 30 frames per second just to make it rounder numbers. And 30 frames per second is typically what a lot of people shoot for YouTube. If you're doing vlog style, documentary style for things like wildlife and stuff like that, 30 frames per second will often be your chosen frame rate. It all depends on the 24 or 30 is a personal preference, but you'll have similar impacts with shutter angles between them. Basically, you're typically going to have shutter angles from 15 to 360 degrees. The smaller the angle, the shorter duration of exposure, as we just saw in that diagram there. So what this means, if you imagine the film is zooming past at 30 frames per second, the 360 degree effectively means there's no shutter, so each frame is exposed for 1/30th of a second. If you have a 180 degree shutter angle, which is the most preferred one, you've got a half disc, and as that's spinning in front, the film is going to only be exposed for half of the time it's in front of the lens. Shutter angle 90 degrees, again, you're looking at a quarter, you're cutting off the light for only a quarter of the time that frame is in front of the lens is it being exposed, and at 45 degrees, only an eighth of the time is it being exposed. The best way I can explain shutter angle and the impacts of it is to kind of put your photographer hat on a little bit. So if you're new to videography and you're trying to get a grasp on this, you hopefully understand photography. When you're dealing with 360 degree shutter, that 1/30th of a second exposure, that's how long the film is going to be exposed. If you think from a photographer standpoint, 30 frames per second is very difficult to get a sharp photo, especially if you're dealing with any long lenses, anything like that. But 30 frames per second, if you're really stable, any movement of your subject will show in 30 frames per second. Any movement of the camera will show in 30 frames per second. So when you're dealing, that's why that 360 degree shutter angle, when you're dealing with 1/30th second, you can end up with a lot of motion blur in the image. So it's less than ideal because it's such a slow shutter speed, any motion will be shown. However, if you think about an owl photograph here, so this owl was shot at 1/30th second, and it's razor sharp. What does that mean when you're dealing with 360 degree shutter angle? So if you don't have any movement of your subject, so you got a very, very slow movement of your subject, and you're on a tripod, you can easily shoot at 360 degree shutter angle. Why would you want that? Well, for Owl, it's a perfect example of that, where you're dealing with a really low light situation. The lower your shutter speed, the lower your ISO. So from going from 1/60th of a second shutter speed to 1/30th of a second shutter speed, you're going from 8,000 ISO to 4,000 ISO. You're immediately going to a much better image. So huge advantage to utilize that 360-degree shutter in very low light situations. So very specific situation, still subject on a tripod. Anything else, you're going to end up with a blur to it all. You're going to end up with, and you can end up with like a dreamy effect to it, which may be what you're going for. In some situations, having that, it's called, like I said, using shutter drag, it kind of can give a dreamy effect to the scene where, especially if you're following your subject tightly and you're moving, you'll get a smearing of the background, which will kind of give a dreamy effect to your video, which may be an effect that you're going for. Now, 180-degree shutter angle, this is considered the norm. So 180 degrees, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you're looking at 1/48th of a second shutter speed. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you're going to be shooting at 1/60th of a second shutter speed. And the reason those two numbers really stand out, especially when you're dealing with 24 and 30 frames per second, is that you basically, from frame to frame of your video, there will be some natural motion blur. And why this is important is that you can imagine a bird flapping its wings if you're following someone running. Going back to that flipping through where you've got that stuttering. At 24 frames per second, if every frame is sharp, you will start to see a stuttering of that because every frame is sharp. So ideally with this 180-degree shutter angle, because you're shooting at 1/48th of a second, it's still quite a slow shutter speed, you will see a natural bit of blur that basically goes between frames as the video is rolling. So because you've got some natural motion blur, everything looks nice and smooth. Right now, I'm actually not even sure what the frame rate I'm shooting this at. I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, and I haven't set this. I'm actually shooting today on the Osmo Pocket 3. Normally, I'd be shooting on the Z8, but because we will be looking at how I set up the shooting banks, I figured we'd try the Osmo Pocket 3 for this studio shot today. And today, I'm using the new 2x opticals. This is a 40 mil optical zoom that they've just implemented with the new Osmo Pocket 3 firmware update, which is another really cool update. So I love when these companies do these really positive firmware updates. Back to shutter angle. So 180-degree shutter angle for 24 and 30 frames per second is definitely the most desired. And that's one of the beautiful things with the new firmware update, which we're going to show is how to lock all that off. Basically, just you can set that and forget it. And then you can just if you're in a shoot where you've got that owl and you need to drop the shutter speed, we'll show you how to do that. And then also, if you want to kind of take advantage of from a film standpoint, not necessarily for wildlife, but there will be some instances where you could actually want to utilize some of these for dramatic effect. Let's take a look at 90-degree and 45-degree shutter angle. So once you get into the skinnier side of the shutter angle, what happens is your shutter speed is getting faster. So now you're up to, at a 90-degree shutter angle at 30 frames per second, you're going to be up to 1/120th of a second because you're only exposing for a quarter of that shutter. At 1/120th of a second, you're getting much sharper frames. When you look at 45-degree shutter angle, you're now at 1/8, so only an eighth of the shutter is allowing light through. You're up to 1/240th of a second. So at 1/240th, almost everything is going to be sharp except for the fastest movement. And again, you can, like I said, you can go all the way down to 15. I'm not even sure, like 15-degree shutter angle. You can really kind of go real skinny on the shutter angle, and everything's going to be sharp. Where this is typically utilized, if you think Saving Private Ryan is an example that's often used where they utilized a skinny shutter angle. So the scenes where they are storming the Normandy beach, it's a very impactful. Everything's extremely sharp. So they basically used 90-degree shutter angle and 45-degree shutter angle. So it was shot at 24 frames per second, and then they used these skinnier shutter angles to get sharper frames. And it almost gives a strobing effect where The explosions, instead of blur of the rocks from the explosions, you end up with a grittier, sharper effort. You can see the rocks, you can see everything blasting off, and it just makes for a sharper image all around. It makes for a more jarring, more intense experience. So this could be something that you could actually utilize. Is a bear chasing salmon would be a good example where this might actually work. Where if you're not shooting in slow motion, but you still want to get some dramatic effect, a bear running down the river shot at a skinny shutter angle is going to get a very sharp effect where the water, as it's running, the water splash and everything else would come off quite dramatic. And that'd be a situation where you might utilize the skinny shutter angles for wildlife videography. So yeah, so that's kind of the basics of shutter angle. And so from the 180-degree shutter angle, like I said, where you're getting that blur between frames, which is the easiest for the viewer. It gives a really nice cinematic look. You've got a natural blur, very smooth video footage. And that's kind of your classic take on shutter angle. The other side, the skinny side, it said you got the jarring side of it, but also a lot of now with the 8K on the Nikon Z8, what a lot of people do is shoot at 60 frames per second video at a skinny shutter angle. All your frames will be sharp. Then you can then go pull shots out of that. So instead of worrying about the pre-capture and trying to press the button and get the shot, you can just shoot 8K video at a skinny shutter angle, and you're basically gonna be shooting at, you can shoot at 1/1000th, 1/2000th of a second at that 60 frames per second rate, and you can just pull frames, sharp frames out of it. And that's another technique that some people utilize when shooting with these cameras, especially in 8K. Now, when you're looking at or shooting at a high frame rate with the intention of slowing it down, shutter angle becomes a little bit more murky as to the benefits or effects of it. This one's a little more difficult, and it's a tougher to tell the actual difference, because as you increase the frame rate, the frames per second, you will be shortening the duration of exposure. So at 60 frames per second, at 360-degree shutter angle, you're still at 1/60th of a second, which is the same as 180-degree shutter angle on 30 frames per second, which is kind of that ideal frame rate. When you're dealing with the higher frame rates, what makes sense to shoot? Does shutter angle impact it as much? Not from my testing, you don't really notice it as much from either end, from either from the 360 down to the 45-degree. Either side of it, you don't notice it as much because you're dealing with so many frames, and you're dealing with a higher frame rate. It's not as noticeable. So I think you do have a little more leeway there. And the reason being is, if you look at the 360-degree shutter angle, the 60 frames per second is 1/60th of a second. The 120 frames per second is 1/120th of a second. So at 120 frames per second, at a 360-degree shutter angle, you're already dealing with a shutter speed that's almost fast enough to stop any blur between frames. So even at the minimum with 120, it's already at a point where you're not going to see any motion blur between frames. So that's where I think you've got a little more leeway there. So shooting at 360-degree shutter angle with a high frame rate was one way to kind of keep the ISO down a little bit when needed. On a bright day, obviously not an issue. But this is when you're dealing with these shutter angles, it does give you a little bit more, like I say, if you're a little bit lower light, trying to do some higher frame rate shooting, you can definitely shoot at 360, no problem. And I would definitely test this out for yourself, see if you can notice the difference. I personally don't notice that difference that much. At 180-degree shutter angle, that 60 frames per second is 1/120th, so you're right back at that. And then 120 frames per second would be 1/240th. This is one of the reasons, if you ever hear that people talk about how 60 frames per second is so sharp. And the reason being is that if you shoot 60 frames per second and deliver it, so you record the video and deliver it at 60 frames per second to play it back on YouTube at 60 frames per second or on your TV at 60 frames per second, that 60 frames per second at 180-degree shutter angle at 1/120th of a second exposure means every single frame is sharp. Because you've got 60 frames per second, you've got very, very fast shutter speed, very, very fast frame rate. at a very quick exposure rate. So every frame is sharp. So you end up with with almost a clinical sharpness to your video, which from a wildlife or macro standpoint can be great. And it might be something you're actually going for. So shooting at 60 frames per second at 1/80th at a 180-degree angle can definitely be something that a look that you might be going for with wildlife photography and documentary photography. But each of these will have their place where definitely encourage you to play with the different frame rates and shutter angles, depending on what frame rates you want to shoot at and what frame rate you want to deliver at. And that's with all this, with video recording, not only are what you're recording at, it's what you plan on delivering at. And I can't really give examples in this video of what 60 frames per second video is going to look like played back at 60 frames per second because I'm recording this video at 24 frames per second. So you can't show what that 60 looks like on a 24 per second timeline. And that's one of the difficult things when you're talking about frame rates and how it looks. You literally have to make a video for each one in order to give you an idea of how those frame rates will look being played back. Okay, so now let's jump to the Nikon Z8. 180-degree shutter angle for most situations is going to be the best case scenario. Basically, so 180-degree shutter angle means you're going to get a little bit of blur between frames. You're going to get nice motion on your videos. With an implementation of shutter angle in this new firmware update, prior to this, every time you switch frame rate, so I like to shoot in a lot of different frame rates. As a wildlife videographer, you've got you'll be constantly changing frame rates from 8K 60, 4K 120, 4K 30, 4K 24, depending on what subject you're recording, depending on what you're trying to capture, the essence of whether you're planning on slowing it down later in post-processing or you want to play it at real time, you're going to want to have access to all those different frame rates. And the shutter angle basically means that when you set it to 180-degree shutter angle, every time you change frame rates now, you're basically at the correct shutter speed. You don't have to worry about shutter speed. Now with shutter angle, the camera is basically in automatic mode. It basically just, when you make that change, it automatically adjusts your shutter speed for you. So if you're new to videography, it makes things so simple. By changing your shutter angle to 180 degrees, as you change frame rates in your videos to shoot different frame rates, you're going to be at the correct shutter speed, unless you want to take some creative license with it and adjust the shutter angle accordingly. But setting it to 180 degrees is basically the right decision all the time, unless you want to do something above and beyond that yourself. So this is great. If you're new to videography, you definitely want to make this change, and then we're going to demonstrate where you change it and then how to lock it off so that if you shoot in banks like I do, I shoot in from bank A to bank D. This will now allow you to basically set it and forget it for 98% of your videography. Okay, let's start in on it. So first off, we're going to click menu and we're going to go to the G. So the G is the video side of the settings. When you're doing any changes on the Nikon Z8 camera, there's a photography side and a video side of it. So we want to make sure on the video side of it. So we're going to be in G for video. We're going to scroll down to G13, and this is where you see shutter mode, and it's going to automatically be set at speed. So we're going to change that to shutter angle. Now when you go back, you will see down here where it now says 180-degree shutter. And so it's changed from shutter speed, which would be 1/60th of a second, or it'd be 1/120th of a second in 60p. Now at 180 degrees, it's going to be automatically picking 1/120th. So you don't have to think about it. It's great. It makes it it's so easy when you're changing frame rates, you're shooting multiple different frame rates. You don't have to worry about the shutter speed anymore. Awesome update, and it's great. How I've set my camera up with the shooting banks is with the eye menu. When I click the eye, ideally when I do, I'm going to leave this over the frame rate. So this is where you can see right now the 8.3K 60p is highlighted for frame rate. The reason being is that, so when I push the eye menu button on the back here, automatically it's going to frame rate when I'm in video mode. So now all I need to do, when I spin the back dial, I can quickly go through all the different frame rates. say I want to go from 8K 60 to 4K 120. I want to do some slow motion video where I'm going to be slowing it down in post. You basically, just by spinning the dial, when you half press the shutter button, it changes to the 4K 120. You can see up here, it's changed it to 4K 120. It's a beautiful way of doing it. I think a lot of times people will hit the I menu and then they start using the D-pad to move around, but you don't have to do that. So basically all I'm doing here, I hit the I button, then I'm just scrolling on the back button, and you can see how it's changing for the frame rates. Then when I partially engage the shutter, it will automatically jump to that new frame rate. It's an amazing way to basically switch. And so if you are shooting a lot of different frame rates, it's a really nice, quick, and easy way to switch between them all. Okay, so now the one thing that you will notice, if you haven't seen that 180 degree pop up, it's still showing shutter speed. What's happened is in this latest firmware update, everything, you see the M up top and left here, this new update has changed all your banks back to P or program mode. So if you were set in aperture priority or manual mode, you do have to change it back to your desired mode. This also won't show if you're in aperture or shutter priority. You do have to be in manual mode. If you are shooting video with the Nikon Z8, I encourage you to definitely you want to shoot in manual mode. A lot of features are not available if you're not in manual mode. So manual mode with auto ISO and now with shutter angle, you are really getting into a almost an automatic setting mode for shooting video. So basically, your shutter speed with shutter angle is going to be predetermined, but whether if you pick 180 degrees, it's set, like I say, 98% of the time, it's going to be the correct shutter speed you want. Auto ISO is going to automatically kind of adjust the ISO to get your exposure correctly. And then from there, you can adjust the aperture or a neutral density filter on the front of your lens to help kind of manage the exposure on brighter days, for example. I find shooting with the with a 5.6 lens and shooting with NRAW and N-Log, where my base ISO for auto ISO is 800, other than the brightest days, I'm able to, I'm finding my exposures are generally, I have no problems with my exposure except for on the brightest days where I might have to bump the aperture down a little bit. Or if you switch it out of auto ISO, you can go below 800 ISO, and that's a little trick. So like I said, with auto ISO, you can't go, it won't go below 800, but you can change it out of auto ISO and you can knock the ISO lower if needed. But I find for most situations as a wildlife photographer, that base ISO of 800 ISO, it might look really blown out in the viewfinder, but if you check your waveform, like you can see here, as long as you're not clipping those whites, NRAW has got incredible adjustability in DaVinci Resolve. You can really knock down. So as long as those whites aren't clipping at the top, they can be right up to the top. And in post-production, you can bring all of it back and it's totally protected the whites. It's an amazing, the Nikon Z8, it's an amazing sensor for video. And like I said, it might appear that you've blown things right out, but as long as you're not clipping on that waveform, you're good to go, which is good, a really handy thing to know. So with this 180 degree shutter, it's kind of like, say, it's the perfect, it's going to be the perfect setting for most videos you're going to be recording. So what you want to do is you can lock it off. So you're going to click on the menu button. We're going to go down. We're going to be in the video side of it again. There are control lock for the photo side of it. We don't want to touch that. So with this, you've got two options about how you're going to lock this off. You've got control lock, which is a global, which basically locks it right off. You can turn the shutter speed lock on. And so the shutter speed lock is referring to the shutter angle here. So when you turn it on, you'll notice now there's a little L at the bottom there. So that's a quick and easy. If you're not going to be super creative with your videography, lock it 180 degrees, you're good to go. You just leave it there. I will find that there's instances where I do like to utilize 360 degree shutter. Like I said, We'll talk about that a bunch in the next video, but there is instances where I will like to go to a slower shutter speed. And I generally don't go to a higher shutter speed. Creatively, there is some reasons to do that. Again, we'll talk about that in the next video. But for now, we're just going to look at the option of being able to drop it down a little bit. And a big example of that would be owls in the forest, where in order to get my ISO a little bit lower, I want to shoot at the same shutter speed as the frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, I want to shoot at 1/30th the second shutter speed. Because there's very little movement, it won't impact the video at all. So in order to access that, how I've set this up is we go back to menu, and we're going to go to custom controls. And what I've done here is that I don't utilize, so for my video mode, in order to record video, so I've set my camera up where the shutter button is my start and stop for video recording. So I kind of like that. I find the video record button is a little bit far over if you're stopping and starting a lot. So I set my shutter button up as my stop and start for recording video. So because of that, I have the video record button on the camera is open as a function button. And I have set that for lock mode. So what this means is that I've set this to control lock. So when I push that button along with the back dial on the camera, so if I push this button here with the back dial on the camera, you can see how the lock button, the lock goes on and off on the shutter angle. So that's a great way to access the lock feature without having to dive into menus. And it's something that I won't necessarily use a lot, but I do find there's instances where I will be changing the shutter speed essentially to 360 degrees. So when it's unlocked, I can change it to 360 degrees. So you notice how the ISO drops. And that's one of the big reasons you'd want to shoot at 360, to lower your ISO in low light conditions where you have very little movement of your subject or the camera. And that's, like I say, that lock feature, and then you just kind of set it back to 180, hold down the video record button, spin the back dial, and you're locked off again. Now I will do this for all of my shooting banks. So you can see my shooting, and you want to, if you need to do this on every shooting bank in order to have access to it. With the video record button and the back dial, I can just turn that lock on and off. I find with a lot of my shooting banks, as much as I've got changes between them depending on subject matter, I try to keep a lot of the controls in a similar place, in a similar position. So you've got muscle memory. You just know where to find what you're looking for. And yeah, so that's the kind of the quick and easy of shutter angle with the new firmware 2.10 and how to set it up for the Nikon Z8, and just how you can go through and adjust it. And this will also work if you're shooting in H.265. You can still utilize the I menu to change shutter speeds along with shutter lock, and it will work for everything. Thanks for joining me today. I have just set up a link to my PayPal account if you want to help me out and help me grow this channel. I appreciate any donations that can be made there, and I really appreciate that. And yeah, thanks for joining me. Please like and subscribe, and till next time, we'll see you out there. Take care. Thanks.